Nobody tells you that missing someone can feel like a second injury, that you can replay a moment, something they said, something they didn't say, and feel your chest tighten the same way it did the first time. Not softened by distance, not dulled by everything that came after, just there, still sitting in you somewhere, quiet and patient, like it was never planning to leave. And the strangest part isn't even that you miss them, it's that you know exactly what they did. You've thought about it enough times, you've had the conversations in your head, the ones where you finally say everything clearly, where you're calm and precise and you don't stumble over any of it. You understand it, intellectually. You've named it. And somehow, the ache persists anyway. That's the part that's hard to admit out loud, because on paper, it should be simple. Someone treated you in a way that left a mark. You step back, you create distance. Maybe you grieve it quietly for a while, and eventually, in theory, you move forward. The emotional math seems straightforward, but somewhere between knowing and feeling, there's this gap you keep falling into, and you can't always explain why. You'll be fine for days, weeks even, getting through your routines, talking to people, laughing at things. And then something small, a song, a specific kind of afternoon light, the way someone tilts their head. And it's back. That particular weight. Not grief exactly, not quite longing, something that doesn't fit cleanly into either category, something you'd rather not examine too closely. So you don't. Most people don't. It's easier to stay on the surface of it, to say, I've moved on, and hope that saying it enough times makes it settle into truth. To keep yourself busy enough that the stillness doesn't catch you, because the stillness is when it comes back. 2 a.m. is when it comes back. Lying in the dark, with nothing competing for your attention, and there it is again. This person, this thing that happened, this version of yourself that existed around them. There's a specific loneliness to that, the kind you can't really describe to someone else without watching their expression shift into gentle concern, which somehow makes it worse. Because what you're trying to say isn't, I'm struggling. It's something more precise than that. Something like, I don't understand why I still carry this, and the not understanding is its own kind of weight. You've probably told yourself a version of the same story more than once. Rearranged the same details, looking for the part where it makes sense, where your feelings and the facts of the situation finally line up neatly. But they don't, quite. There's always something left over, some residue that the logic doesn't account for. And it's tempting to interpret that residue as weakness, as some personal failing, that you can't simply decide to feel differently and then feel differently. But it's worth sitting with the strangeness of it for a moment before jumping to that conclusion. Because what if the ache isn't a sign that something is wrong with you? What if it's actually pointing at something much more specific? Something about the way you formed that attachment in the first place. People talk about letting go as though it's a single, clean action, a door closing. But most people who've actually tried to let something go know it's not like that. It's more like learning to carry something differently, shifting the weight. And before you can even do that, you need to understand what you're actually carrying. Because more often than not, it isn't just the person. There's something underneath the person. Something the relationship was doing for you, or maybe to you, that you haven't quite named yet. And that thing, that unnamed thing, doesn't go away just because the relationship did. It waits. This is where most conversations about toxic relationships or healing stop short. They tell you what to do without ever getting close to why the doing is so difficult. Why someone who genuinely hurt you can still feel like a missing piece. Why your nervous system doesn't seem to have received the same memo your brain did. And in the next part, we're going to get into exactly that. Not with advice, not with a framework for moving on, but by going further into the psychology of what actually forms between two people and why certain attachments leave marks that outlast the reasons they should. It's more specific than most people realize, and once you see it, a lot of things start to make a different kind of sense. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. There's something that happens gradually, so gradually you almost can't catch it happening. You start adjusting. Small things at first, the way you phrase something, what you choose to mention, and what you leave out. You tell yourself, it's just reading the room, being considerate. The kind of thing emotionally intelligent people do. And maybe it starts that way. But at some point, the adjusting stops being occasional and starts being automatic, and you stop noticing the difference between choosing how to show up and just not fully showing up. That version of yourself, the edited one, starts to feel normal, comfortable even, like a habit you don't remember forming. And here's what makes that difficult to sit with. You can't always trace when it started. You look back and try to find the moment where you began shrinking slightly in certain conversations, or going quiet about things that mattered to you, or laughing things off that you didn't actually find funny. But there's no single moment. It was incremental, and incremental changes don't leave clean evidence. What they leave is this vague sense that somewhere along the way you drifted a little from yourself. Not dramatically. Not in any way someone else would necessarily notice. Just enough that when you're alone and quiet, there's occasionally this feeling, faint, hard to name, that you've been performing a version of yourself rather than inhabiting one. Most people have experienced this and called it something else, stress maybe, or just going through something. The emotional vocabulary for this particular experience is surprisingly limited, which is part of why it stays unexamined. You can't really investigate something you don't have a word for, so it just sits there, underneath the daily routines, occasionally surfacing in moments when you least want it to. Like when someone asks how you're doing and you answer before you've even checked. That gap between the question and the automatic response is so small that most people never notice it exists. But it does exist. And if you've ever caught yourself mid-sentence realizing you're describing a version of your life rather than actually feeling it, you know exactly what that gap feels like. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from this. Not physical tiredness, not the kind that sleep fixes. It's more like a low-grade depletion that follows you into conversations, into rooms full of people, into situations that are technically fine. Nothing is wrong, nothing you could point to, and yet you feel faintly absent from them, present in body, somewhere else in every other way. The strange thing about that feeling is that it's often worst around people who seem close to you. Not strangers. People you know well, people who care about you. And that's disorienting, because the story you've been told about connection is that closeness is supposed to feel like relief. But sometimes it feels like pressure. Like being seen requires showing the edited version clearly enough that they don't accidentally see past it. That's not cynicism. It's something more uncomfortable than cynicism. It's the quiet realization that some of your relationships have been built, at least partly, around a version of you that you constructed under stress. And dismantling that version, even slightly, feels like a risk you haven't consciously decided whether you're willing to take. So, instead, you maintain it. Not deliberately. You're not calculating. You're just doing what became familiar. And familiarity has a gravity to it that's easy to underestimate. It pulls you toward patterns that feel safe even when they cost you something, and you don't always notice the cost until it's accumulated into something heavier than you expected. Here's where it gets stranger. The people who created the conditions where you learn to edit yourself most, they're sometimes the ones you miss most acutely. Not despite the editing, maybe in some way because of it, because you poured something real into that dynamic, not just emotion, but adaptation, effort, the particular energy it takes to keep calibrating yourself around another person. And when that relationship ends or changes, all of that calibration suddenly has nowhere to go. You're left with these reflexes that no longer have a target. Habits of thought and behavior that were shaped by that specific dynamic, now running quietly in the background of your life with no context for them. And missing the person sometimes feels less like longing for them specifically and more like longing for the structure that made those parts of you feel like they had a purpose. Even if the structure was painful, even if it cost you things. That's the part people rarely say directly, that sometimes you miss being needed in a particular way, or miss the version of yourself that knew exactly how to navigate that specific relationship, even when the navigation was hard, because at least it was familiar. At least you knew where you stood, even when where you stood wasn't great. And underneath all of that, quieter than any of it, there's a question that most people push away before it fully forms. Not because it's too painful, exactly, but because it points at something that feels destabilizing to look at directly, something about why certain relationships shaped you the way they did, not just emotionally, but behaviorally, structurally, why you adapted so readily in some dynamics and not others, why the emotional residue from particular people seems embedded differently, deeper somehow, more load-bearing than the residue from people who treated you better. That question doesn't have a simple answer, but it does have a real one. And in the next part, we're going to move closer to it, not from the outside, not with a framework or a label, but from inside the experience itself. Because the pattern that's actually driving this is something most people are living inside of without ever having seen it clearly. And once you start to see it, a lot of what feels like personal failure or emotional weakness starts to look like something else entirely, something that makes a different kind of sense. At some point, without deciding to, you learned what love felt like, not in the abstract, in the specific, in the texture of particular interactions, what it felt like when someone paid attention to you, what it felt like when they didn't, what you had to do or be or suppress in order to stay in the warmth of someone's presence. You learned all of this before you had the language for it, which means you learned it not as knowledge, but as instinct. And instinct doesn't argue with you, it just runs. Most people carry an emotional template they didn't choose and have never fully examined. A set of conditions under which connection feels real, under which being cared for registers as genuine. And the uncomfortable thing about that template is that it isn't built from your best experiences. It's built from your earliest ones. The ones where you were learning the rules, reading the room, figuring out what was safe to show and what was safer to keep hidden. That process leaves something behind. Not a memory, exactly. More like a calibration, a sense of what closeness is supposed to feel like. And it doesn't always feel comfortable. Sometimes it feels like uncertainty, like never quite knowing where you stand, like earning something that never fully arrives. And if that's where you learn to recognize connection, then comfortable, stable relationships can feel strangely off-register. Not bad, just unfamiliar in a way that's hard to trust. This is where it becomes difficult to look at directly, because the people who hurt you, who created exactly that dynamic of uncertainty, of intermittent closeness, of never quite being enough, and then suddenly being more than enough. Those people didn't feel like a mismatch to something inside you. They felt like a match, not consciously, not in any way you'd have chosen if you'd been choosing clearly, but emotionally at the level where recognition happens before thinking does, something about them felt known. And known at that level can be mistaken for right. That's not a flaw in your character. It's not evidence that you're drawn to pain or that some part of you believes you deserve difficulty. It's more precise than that. It's that your emotional recognition system was calibrated in a particular environment, and it's doing exactly what it was built to do, identifying what it knows. The problem is simply that what it knows isn't always what's good for you. Those two things, what's familiar and what's nourishing, are not the same thing. But they can feel almost identical from the inside. So you stayed, or you kept going back. Or even after it ended, part of you kept gravitating toward the memory of it. Not because you're weak, not because you don't understand what happened, but because something in the pattern felt like home. And home is the most powerful pull there is, even when the home you're remembering wasn't particularly safe. Here's where something quieter emerges, something harder to admit. When those relationships ended or shifted or simply stopped giving you what they occasionally gave you, it wasn't only the person you lost. You also lost the particular version of yourself that existed inside that dynamic. The self that was always working, always reading the situation, always managing the emotional temperature of the room. That self was exhausting to be, but it was also, in a strange way, purposeful. There's an identity that forms inside difficult relationships, not a healthy one, but a real one. A self organized around someone else's emotional rhythms, around the effort of keeping something functional that keeps threatening to become dysfunctional. And when the relationship ends, that self doesn't have a clean exit. It just floats, unanchored, looking for a context where its skills still apply. Which is part of why you might find yourself overthinking long after there's anything left to think about. The mental habit of managing, anticipating, interpreting. It doesn't dissolve when the relationship does. It keeps running in the background, scanning for something to apply itself to, occasionally landing on old memories and running through them again, as if this time you might find the thing you missed. And underneath that compulsive revisiting, if you go quiet enough to hear it, there's something that isn't really about the other person at all. It's a question about yourself, about whether you are fundamentally someone who has to earn closeness, or whether closeness is something you're allowed to simply have. About whether the difficulty in those relationships was the cost of being loved, or just the cost. Whether you'd adapted so thoroughly to relationships that required constant effort that you'd come to associate effort with meaning. That's a slow thing to see in yourself. It doesn't arrive as a revelation. It arrives as a faint discomfort when things are too easy. A slight distrust of people who are consistently kind, because consistent kindness doesn't match the template. A tendency to wait for the other shoe in situations that are actually fine, because some part of you can't yet believe that fine is real. And here's what's strange about recognizing this. It doesn't immediately change anything. You can see the pattern fairly clearly and still feel the pull of what's familiar. Understanding isn't the same as being free from something, but it is different from not understanding. And the difference, subtle as it is, matters. Because the moment you start to see a pattern as a pattern rather than as a fixed truth about who you are, something shifts, not dramatically. Not all at once, but something in the way you hold these feelings starts to change. The missing, the exhaustion, the reflexes that no longer have a clear target. They start to look less like personal failing and more like the entirely logical result of something that happened to you over time. Something you didn't design. Something you might, slowly, be able to revise. In the next part, we'll look at what that actually involves, not as a process to complete, but as a shift in understanding that changes the emotional ground you're standing on. There's a particular moment that happens sometimes, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, where you're in the middle of an ordinary day and something small makes you stop. Not because it's painful exactly, but because something about it is suddenly visible in a way it wasn't before. Like a room you've been living in for years, and you suddenly notice the shape of it, the way the light falls, the arrangement of things you got so used to that they became invisible. That's not insight in the way people usually describe insight. It doesn't arrive with clarity and resolution. It arrives more like a slight double take, a quiet "oh." And that "oh" is actually where something starts, not healing, not transformation, just a small, real shift in how you're holding something that you've been carrying for a long time without quite being able to set down. What shifts, specifically, is the story, not the facts. The facts don't change. What changes is the frame around them. The difference between seeing your own emotional patterns as evidence of something broken in you and seeing them as evidence of something that happened to you. Those two things can look identical from the outside, but from the inside, they feel completely different. One carries weight you've been told is yours to own. The other carries weight you can finally look at without flinching. Most people have spent years interpreting their own emotional responses as character flaws, the over-attachment, the missing people who weren't good for them, the difficulty trusting situations that are genuinely calm. They get filed under "I'm too much" or "I'm not enough" or "something is wrong with how I work." And that filing system is so habitual that challenging it feels almost dangerous. Because if it isn't a flaw, then what is it? And if it isn't your fault, then why did it keep happening? Those are honest questions. They deserve to sit for a while rather than be answered too quickly. Because the thing about recognizing a pattern is that it doesn't immediately come with emotional relief. You can understand intellectually that you were conditioned to associate closeness with uncertainty, that your nervous system learned to read tension as intimacy, that the relationships which cost you the most felt the most real, partly because of how much they cost, and still feel the pull of that old, familiar weight. Understanding doesn't overwrite the conditioning. It just gives you a slightly different vantage point from which to observe it happening. That vantage point, quiet as it is not nothing. It's the difference between being inside a reaction completely and noticing you're in a reaction. A fraction of a second of awareness where before there was only impulse. That gap is small, but it's real, and it's where something actually begins to shift, not because you decided to shift it, but because you can finally see it as something separate from yourself. A pattern you developed rather than a truth about who you are. There's something else that tends to surface around this point. A kind of grief that doesn't announce itself as grief. It arrives as a low, quiet heaviness when you realize how much energy you've spent maintaining a version of yourself that was mostly built to keep others comfortable. How many conversations you edited yourself out of. How many times you held something back that was entirely worth saying. Not because you were forced to, but because somewhere along the way, making yourself smaller felt safer than the alternative. And that felt like a choice, so you blamed yourself for making it. But a choice made under the chronic pressure of not knowing if you'll be accepted as you are isn't really a free choice. It's an adaptation. And the exhaustion you feel isn't weakness. It's what years of adaptation actually feels like when you finally stop long enough to notice the weight of it. That's not a comforting thought. It doesn't feel good to see clearly how much of yourself you quietly put aside in certain relationships. But there's something underneath the discomfort. Something that, if you sit with it long enough without trying to resolve it, starts to feel more like honesty than pain. Like finally being in the same room as a true version of something that you've been looking at through the wrong window for a long time. And the missing, that persistent, inconvenient ache for people who weren't always good for you, starts to look a little different from here too. Not like weakness, not like evidence that you can't let go or that you're still attached to something you should have released. More like a signal, a record of where your emotional energy went, how deeply you invested in something, how real it felt regardless of how it ended. You can miss something that hurt you and not be confused by that. You can understand why the pattern formed and still feel it pulling. You can see yourself clearly and still be figuring out what to do with that clarity. None of this resolves into a neat conclusion. It just becomes something you're living with more consciously than before. A slightly different relationship to your own emotional life. Less punishing, less bewildered, a little more willing to observe without immediately interpreting. And maybe that's enough for now. Not a destination, just a different angle, a slightly quieter way of being inside your own experience. The missing doesn't disappear, but it becomes something you understand rather than something that just happens to you, and you stay with that for a while. If any part of this felt like something you've been trying to find the words for, tell me in the comments. Not because there's a right answer, but because sometimes naming the thing is the first real step toward being able to see it.